Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers. You'll notice that I'm by myself, so Jasper is away and the cat, meaning me, will play. So I'm going to answer a question all by myself. I'm going to talk to myself and ask myself the question that I'm going to answer. Yes, so the question is from Celtic Ace, one of our patrons. You too can become a patron. I'll get to that at the end. He has a question about the phalanx. What could be the possible reason that this style of warfare came about? It seems strange to use such a formation against infantry, plus why a 9-foot spear? I picture if two phalanxes were to be fighting, it would look like two bucks or stags, or for the European fellas, he said that, fighting. Well, that is a big question to answer. The phalanx is a term that we tend to want to use as a technical term, but in fact it's a dense mass of men. And if I'm right off the top of my head, the term is used way back in Homeric warfare, but it's what is a phalanx, what isn't a phalanx. And as warfare develops, we get into another set of controversies, because let's face it, a bunch of men fighting, standing together in close proximity to one another, will look very similar to a bunch of trained men standing very closely together in proximity to one another. And they are very different things. So one is a mass of untrained, one is a mass of trained. The next issue that comes about is the idea, of course, that these are all, in the archaic period, they're all carrying shields of different kinds, and so it is technically a shield wall. If it is the same kind of detailed training that hoplite phalanx shield walls require, probably not. And so we then get into another debate about the development of the phalanx, the classical Greek hoplite phalanx. Depending on the scholar, we've got a period from the 8th century BC down to, well, these days people are wanting to push the development of the phalanx even into the 6th and 5th centuries BC. The time of the Persian Wars, the phalanx is just coming into its own. Others would argue that it's an earlier formation, and the poetry of Tyrtaeus and even some of the passages in Homer reflect an early Greek phalanx, which I don't really want to get into because you can't do that in 10 minutes. But what you've got is the idea that perhaps there is this development of a round Argive shield, the aspis, that is the classical hoplite shield that we know, and it then leads to developments in interlocking those shields and overlapping those shields so that you get a solid shield wall. And that's, again, something that possibly existed earlier, but it wouldn't have been as uniform in the sense that everyone had the same shaped shield, and therefore the interlocking nature and the overlapping nature of the phalanx was sort of made much more powerful by the fact that everyone had the same kind of equipment. And so when you get that, you start to get the depths of phalanxes. And from the classical period, so generally from the 5th century BC, where we have the evidence, not that much evidence to be honest, we occasionally get depths mentioned, and those depths can be 8 men deep, 12 men deep. We occasionally get 10, I think once we get 10 men deep, and then some other depths as thing goes on, and they start to get bigger and deeper. So we get 16 deep, we get 25 deep, and then at the deepest that they become, Xenophon only mentions a phalanx 50 deep twice, once at the Battle of Leuctra. And so that's sort of this deepening of the phalanx. Now, what you have, therefore, is ranks of men, a certain number deep, standing with shields interlocked and carrying spears. Now, again, there's been a sort of development in argument that were spears thrown, and certainly on some of the vases there are clearly men carrying javelins rather than a thrusting spear. And so you've got this idea that possibly they're javelins first, and that the early phalanx has thrown spears rather than thrusting spears. But certainly by the time of the Persian Wars and the Peloponnesian Wars, it certainly seems as if most spears were thrusting dory spears rather than thrown javelins or even thrown spears. Some of the vases also show throwing loops, so clearly there are thrown spears at some point in the development of the phalanx. And so the thrusting spear is indeed the story. It's somewhere between 2.5 to 3 meters long. Again, I think we're too obsessed today with the uniformity of a spear. A spear's a spear. If your spear happens to be slightly shorter than, the guy next door's, that's not really going to cause too many issues. There's not the sort of factory making of spears as we sort of think about it. They do have cornel wood and ash wood for these spear shafts. So, they would be roughly the same length, but they wouldn't be uniform. The idea that you would charge an enemy formation of a similar phalanx, which is how Greek warfare develops, and there's several parts of Greece which are, of course, suited to heavy infantry battles. Most of Greece, of course, is not suitable to heavy infantry battles clashing in flat plains, and so the plains of Boeotia are called the dancing floor of war. Epaminondas calls them that. And you've got battlefields like Mantinea in the Peloponnese, which gets several battles fought on it because it's a flat plain. You get, Leuctra and Plataea and several other battles that are fought in Boeotia because it has this flat plain. And so the idea that you would have these lines of men coming against one another on a suitable space on a flat plain within Greece certainly seems to be the case. And so what you get in later manuals is the idea that you're not necessarily maneuvering. You are moving your phalanx forward in different ways. There are countermarches and all sorts of different things. But it's very much about a frontal attack until the Peloponnesian War. We start to get the idea of reserves and ambushes and sort of tactical thinking outside of the phalanx versus phalanx frontal assault on another phalanx. And so it very much is a heroic ethos that you get emphasized in the poetry from an earlier age. So in the classical phalanx age, we're still getting people talking about Tyrtaeus and Homer as representative of what's going on in their phalanx. In fact, certainly for Homer, late Roman Empire legions are talking about the appropriateness of Homeric descriptions of what they're doing. So there is very much a sort of heroic ethos of standing in the shield wall of a phalanx and facing your enemy, wounds in front, doing your duty, standing facing the enemy. So there is part of that actually standing there and not breaking and running when the enemy came at you is certainly part of it. Charging an enemy and not breaking formation is also part of it. That's what we find at the Battle of Marathon by the Athenians, that they charged the Persians, and at the other battles like at the Battle of Mantinea in 418 BC, the Spartans charge the Athenian and Mantinean line. The Athenians and Mantineans are much more pell-mell in their charge, and when the disciplined Spartans come at them, they break and run very quickly. So you've got that sort of idea that there's the issue of being brave enough to stand in that wall and do what's required of you. There's also the idea, of course, of and again, this is another debate that we can't get into in a 10-minute podcast, about the athismos, which is the idea that these two shield walls would come together and they would push, literally, what athismos means. And there's a great debate today about whether there is, in fact, an athismos. So the old view of athismos was that it is a literal shoving match, that you've essentially got a giant rugby scrum. Now, in a giant rugby scrum, I don't know, for those of you who aren't English, European, or from the Antipodes, kind of like a line of scrimmage, but much more pushing and to and fro for a lot longer than in a line of scrimmage. So a scrum can last for a lot longer. And that's a problem in the sense that you can't do that for very long before you become exhausted. Not to mention a scrum has 3 ranks, not 8. And, the men behind can't really get to the men in front with their spears. And more than that, the men in the front can't really get to each other with their spears because well, they're pushing. So there's a problem there in terms of that, and in terms of how deep can you be effective with this. Are your weapons effective? One argument, of course, is that the reason for low casualty numbers in a lot of hoplite battles is because no one's actually fighting with their spears when they're pushing, and that most of the casualties occur when one or other of the lines breaks and you're cutting down fleeing men rather than frontally assaulting men who are wearing bronze armor or linen armor and are, pushing rather than stabbing with spears. So there's another big debate about the Thismos. So the argument today is that there's much less pushing and more toing and froing interplay with spears and shields sort of bashing against one another, which again is a debate and it's unresolved. So I think it's a combination of all those things, how this phalanx warfare came about. And the funny thing, of course, is that once it's in play, whether it be the 8th century BC or the very beginning of the 5th, it sticks around. The Macedonian phalanx becomes a thing under Philip II in the 4th century BC, but there are still Greek phalanxes in the phalanx of hoplites, even after the Macedonian phalanx comes to dominate warfare. So it's a style of warfare that stays around for centuries, and I think it's tied up with this sort of ethos of the heroic and this strange combination of let's create a form of warfare that doesn't suit the terrain of our land, but there's a couple of battlefields where we can always meet and fight one another in this style, which I think was much more about proving your Greek sense of manliness than it was necessarily about a strange, round shield, long spear, thrusting at one another kind of warfare. It's much more about a combination of attitudes towards manliness and standing in formation and doing your duty and proving that you can do what's required of a hoplite. So there you go. That's the answer. If you would like to join us on these, you can, of course, become a patron of Ancient Warfare. And for your patron, there's 3 levels. You can even get a subscription to the magazine, and you can ask us questions. Of course, you can ask us questions anyway, but we would love for you to become the patron of Ancient Warfare. So thanks very much. See you soon.